It isn't possible for a single artwork to defeat fascism. What it can do is raise questions, help organize an audience, create solidarity, so that a movement can then be born that will challenge authoritarianism, fascism, violence, racism, all those components of fascism. There is no single shape or form of fascism. If fascism arises in the United States, it won't be wearing a swastika, the men won't have jackboots, you won't see the Hitler salute, you won't hear Sieg Heil. It'll be in the form of Americanism, of Pledge of Allegiance, of the American flag, of MAGA, and all that. You have to, as an artist, to use your instruments in a way that will get people to look. They may be shocked, they may be disturbed, but rather than close the book, they'll want to flip the page.
Welcome to episode 214 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. In today's episode, we're sharing an interview with Steven Eisenman, co-author of the forthcoming book, The Young Person's Illustrated Guide to American Fascism. But first, a big thank you to the patrons and sustainers that make this show possible with their donation of $2 or more a month. Thanks as well to those who are supporting Refuse Fascism by getting a t-shirt or tank top. If you want yours, see the show notes. Patrons have a discount code, and if you want to become a patron, you can do so at patreon.com/refusefascism. Or for zero monies, you can tell a friend about the show, share it on social media, rate the show on your listening platform of choice, or be bold and write a review. They boost the show so much. And I mean, don't you think refusing fascism needs some boosting right now? And they just mean a lot to us. So please consider, after listening, of course, rating and reviewing the show. Before the interview, before we talk about the Democratic National Convention, listen to the doctors who went to the DNC to testify on this war on children in Gaza.
How do you have the energy to secure?
Rage. I'm fueled by a lot of rage.
I was in Gaza working in the ICU in Al-Aqsa Shuhada Hospital for about 3 weeks.
I have been to Gaza twice since the assault began in October.
Went to Gaza in January and was turned away in May after the border was stormed.
I was in Gaza earlier this year and multiple times over the past decade.
As a physician and as a witness on the ground, as one of the few international eyes allowed in Gaza by design, what I saw was indescribable with any other word other than genocide.
I, as a doctor, cannot do my job if my elected leaders and my politicians are making it literally impossible for me to treat patients. I can't save lives if you keep sending weapons.
And it's really tough to reconcile with the fact that you're in the hospitals, you're watching people suffer and die, and to know that overhead there are fighter jets that came from America.
They're making Gaza unlivable. They've destroyed the water infrastructure, and so we were seeing kids die of diarrheal illness. They prevented all medical supplies in, and I can tell that by firsthand witness, not by hearsay. They refused me the medical supplies that I was able to gather over months from wonderful people in Arkansas, things like endotracheal tubes and Foley catheters, things like antibiotics and sedative medications that were denied at the border. Firsthand experience. They do not allow medical supplies into children that are dying.
You heard my colleagues speak just now at the press conference. The fact that these children haunt us in our dreams, the fact that their parents come to us in our dreams, asking us why we didn't save their children.
There's definitely a cognitive dissonance that's required to go from a place where you see children die every day from bombs dropped with Made in USA sign on them, then to come here to the DNC and see almost a party-like atmosphere, ignoring the fact that every day I was in Gaza, I heard children crying for their parents that were gone.
I saw the reality on the ground. I saw the product of our policies. I saw the product of the Biden administration's policies here. And for anybody to suggest that this is just a one issue, or we don't want to make this a one issue vote, I'm offended by that, and I think most people who recognize the tragedy of what's taking place in Gaza, they're offended by that.
And I think all of us are here not because we want to be, we're here because we feel like it's our responsibility, and we feel like we're accountable. We're accountable to all the civilians who were killed, who were injured, who are killed today, who will be killed tomorrow unless the U.S. stops funding this. We are enabling a genocide, and that should be front and center stage at a convention of one of the main two parties of a country's political system.
I know, that's great. Yeah, I don't have any capacity to give anybody excuses anymore. I literally can't. Like, there's no excuse.
The Democratic National Convention, where do we even begin? Let's start with the big picture refresher. We are facing the slow motion cataclysm of global warming. Tens of millions of people around the world have been uprooted from their homelands and flung across the globe without any safety net. Wars between powerful imperialist rivals are raging, with threats of escalation only getting louder. Economies across the globe are increasingly untethered to any stabilizing factors. The outer boundaries of mass exploitation, mass delusion, state violence are being stretched to breaking. There is no going back to any idealized vision of normalcy. The world is never going back to Trump's idea of the 1950s or the 1850s, or to the Democrats' idea of the 1990s. Throughout the convention, the Democratic Party went to great pains this week to frame Trump and MAGA as anomalies, Trump as unserious, weird, narcissistic. Both Harris and Obama spoke about Trump as an agent of chaos, aberrations from some utopia of peace and justice, deranged individuals forcing themselves upon the quote-unquote greatest democracy in the history of the world. If that was true, then yeah, all we would have to do is vote for not them. But there are a few problems with that. First, this strategy of depoliticization is nothing new. It is the Democrats' bread and butter, and it prevents people from challenging the fascist transformation of America. Secondly, the fascists violently rejected the last election loss and have spent 4 years strengthening their capacity to overturn an election loss this November. Trump and the Republic-Fascists have long thrown out the rule book, proving that they no longer abide by the peaceful transfer of power and are readying to subvert the election either through legal maneuvers inviting the intervention of their fascist-stacked Supreme Court or through direct incitement of political violence. The people who failed to hold the January 6th coup plotters to account, including and especially Trump, who did the coup and now gets to redo, were on that DNC main stage, and somehow they seemingly failed to mention the plans for this coming coup, let alone what the Democrats will do in that event. Must be a coincidence. But on an even deeper level, as we've shown extensively over more than 200 episodes of this show, Trump, the 2024 MAGA-fied GOP, and their massive, well-armed fascist movement are not an aberration. They are as American as apple pie, with roots running back centuries, branching through every sphere of society and government and blooming in this time of crises. This is not an anomaly that came out of nowhere and can be swept away by electoral enthusiasm. And that enthusiasm, that joy even, is the tool in the DNC's kit that was on display. Good vibes and patriotism provided the pillars of the convention, and talking about genocide is nothing if not a vibe killer. But this genocide in Gaza is real and is made possible by the person they were there to celebrate. Dan Engelhardt, an uncommitted delegate from Minnesota, put it well.
Our governor is about to say folksy things as the vice presidential candidate, calling people weird. And they are. They're weird for what they believe in, these horrible Republican things. That's weird. But you know what? It's weird to say ceasefire and keep sending the fire. That's weird, Walls!
Dan went on to pose, quote, "When we talk about saving democracy, What the hell democracy do we have when it's funding genocide and arming genocide and everybody wants to feel good and have a damn party when we're killing people, end quote. When confronted with their culpability in this crime of all crimes, the response from the stage, from the delegates, from liberals across the country was that to stop Trump, we must endorse this genocide, or at least mash our fingers into our ears to drown out the names of the children our candidates' bombs have blown to bits. According to the electoral calculus, one person cannot simultaneously oppose fascism and oppose genocide. It's merely impossible, right? Who would even attempt such a thing? We want to shout out those who protested inside and outside. While certainly it was not nearly enough, shouting out those holding banners in the stands, those chanting ceasefire now as they walked through the convention center. Those who protested in the streets, who stood outside reading the names and ages of children killed by the champions of democracy, those breaking the silence sometimes at the cost of brutality from the police and delegates, to those who were arrested, those who were mocked and forcefully removed, their screams for justice drowned out by crowds chanting, USA, USA, USA. Even after diminishing their demands, the uncommitted delegates' attempts to simply get a Palestinian voice onto the main stage were ignored and dismissed. Adam Johnson put it well, quote, uncommitted is exceedingly polite and insider, and they were still sidelined and thrown scraps. Protests outside the DNC are mocked and given snarky write-ups. There is simply no right way to oppose genocide. You're either ignored, treated like a terrorist, or called a joke, end quote. The DNC's official program and Harris's speech were as bloodthirsty and heartless as every American president, not only rejecting notions of an arms embargo, but declaring that they will continue to arm Israel no matter what. What does it tell you that they are willing to risk giving power to Trump in the name of empire? What the fuck do they think they are doing to stop fascism if it involves arming Trump-loving fascists like Bibi, who is literally starving and torturing captive children in the thousands? In the end, as Bob Avakian has said, quote, if you try to make the Democrats be what they are not and never will be, you will end up being more like what the Democrats actually are, end quote. On the day when at least 40 Palestinians were killed by Israel bombings in Khan Yunis, including over a dozen children, Harris, in accepting her party's nomination, said this.
And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
When speaking of October 7, Harris named the perpetrator and described the crime. But when talking about Palestinians, she would have you believe that tens of thousands just died without cause or explanation, once again treated as some tragic natural disaster, not a misseration the U.S. is directly responsible for. In her acceptance speech, She railed against immigrants and refugees, even saying that her opponent has gotten in the way of thoroughly militarizing the border. To adoring cheers, she committed to ensuring that the United States will always have the quote-unquote strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. Jennifer Rubin, in her Washington Post op-ed, pointed out something that I think is worth noting. Quote, in many ways, it was a speech a Republican of years gone by could have delivered, heavy on crime fighting, securing the border, promising an opportunity society, keeping America's military the quote-unquote most lethal in the world, and standing up to dictators such as Russian President Vladimir Putin, end quote.
We are the heirs to the greatest democracy in the history of the world. And on behalf of our children and our grandchildren and all those who sacrificed so dearly for our freedom and liberty, we must be worthy of this moment. It is now our turn to do what generations before us have done, guided by optimism and faith, to fight for this country we love, to fight for the ideals we cherish, and to uphold the awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American.
In the waning days of Trump's first term, he introduced his 1776 curriculum, a strategy of nationwide indoctrination into the MAGA mythology of America. What Kamala is selling here is not truth to counter lies, but the Democratic Party's own version of that mythology, aiming to rein in an unprecedented awakening to America's real history and role in the world, which has taken off, especially since 2020. Rose-tinted glasses, you see, are one thing, but these red, white, and blue-tinted glasses find a way to justify infants lying glassy-eyed with their brains on the floor amidst their dead and dying families, with thousands more buried under the rubble. The thesis of this multi-million-dollar pageant was not just to revive the Democratic Party, but to redeem America, and to redeem American history, which is being recognized by wider and wider swaths of people in this country to be an ongoing saga of slavery, genocide, empire, war, and exploitation. To redeem the American government as a force for good when we see them funding a genocide in real time on our phones. To redeem the idea of America as a vision of equality and justice when increasing multitudes recognize that American mythology is the peak of imperialist propaganda and mass delusion. That by freedom, America means domination. By justice, America means power. To redeem the governing consensus of America, that the two legitimate parties represent the wills and aspirations of the people living here, and that sharing power between them is the ideal form of government, while in reality both parties have always represented the ruling class and both aim to maintain this empire through cascading crisis. One through the threat of brutal violence, and the other through its unrestrained exercise. This redemption is what we saw on the stage in Chicago, and it was compelling. Even if you were sold rumors of Beyonce and ended up getting a Reagan-worshipping speech from Leon Panetta, it didn't dampen the vibe. They honestly did not have to work that hard. People are so used to the Democratic Party smacking themselves in the face with the pool noodle that they brought to the gunfight that candidates merely using their mouths to make words was hailed as a miracle. So as I close out and get to the main substance of today's show, this interview with Stephen, I wanted to quote again Adam Johnson, writing for The Nation, with a stark reminder, quote, "And so the bombs continue and the party goes on. Gaza is removed from our minds and the field of vision of those attending the big celebration. And everyone, or at least those not on the wrong end of American weapons, gets to feel, quote unquote, joy again," end quote. So where does this leave us? In some ways, this is complicated, but in some ways, it's quite simple. Any social force that is serious about and capable of stopping fascism must be able to oppose genocide. For more on this, recommend listening to episode 212, my interview with Gray, with Ben the Ark, episode 210, The War on Women and the Genocide in Gaza, episode 202, Perspectives on Stopping Fascism, and episode 200, American Fascism, a Retrospective. With that, here is my interview with Stephen. Today, I am so glad to welcome on Stephen Eisenman. Stephen is a professor emeritus of art history at Northwestern University. He is also the author of numerous articles and 9 books, including The Abu Ghraib Effect and The Ecology of Impressionism. Stephen is also a curator, a critic, an activist, and co-founder of the environmental nonprofit Anthropocene Alliance. He's a regular contributor to the online publication Counterpunch. And he has a forthcoming book set to be released this fall, this October to be precise, with artist collaborator Sue Ko, titled The Young Person's Illustrated Guide to American Fascism. Welcome, Stephen. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here, Sam.
Let's start off. Students are going to go back to college, back to high school in just a few weeks if they haven't already. And I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit about this new book that you've created with Sue and what it means to you that it's a young person's guide.
I guess I'm hoping that students coming back to school, to the classrooms, will realize, without being too scared, that they're living in a time of emergency. That is, that the political, environmental, social, cultural circumstances of their lives are risky, if not dangerous, and that they need to prepare themselves and to understand the challenges that they face. And the biggest of those challenges is an environmental crisis and a political crisis that I call a crisis of fascism.
And can you tell us a little bit about some of the themes or elements of the book? Some topics that I've seen in coverage of the book have been the coup attempt, the right to abortion, the border and family separation policy under Trump, the repression of the movement against police murder and for Black lives, the pandemic, anti-science policies, and a lot more. And I wanted to just get your read on what you decided to focus on and why you thought they were so pivotal to, in particular, young people's understanding of this American fascism.
The key thing about the book to remember is that it's an illustrated guide. And the artist is an artist named Sue Ko, who's the world's greatest, I would say, political artist. She's simultaneously a caricaturist, a satirist, a cartoonist, an illustrator, and a fine artist. And the artworks that she produced for the book run the gamut of studies of refugees struggling across the border in the Rio Grande River in Texas, to violence in streets, to Trump and Rupert Murdoch, using their extraordinary megaphones that they have. Some of them are bitter, some of them are angry, some of them are hilariously funny. So that's, I would say, the main component of the book. That's the lure of the book. I'm number 2, I would say. It's a significant text that I produced, and it's aimed at trying to get students, young people, to think about, as I said before, the challenges that they face. It starts off in an unusual way, asking students to think about the prospects for democracy in their own lives. So in order to understand the nature of fascism, which is the obverse of democracy, the opposite of democracy, they need to understand something about the democracy that they have or don't have. So I asked them to consider the times in which they are free to speak, free to act, the ways in which their capacity to form life choices is controlled or impinged upon larger forces. And then after they've done that, to then think about what it would mean not just to have those things limited as they are, but also to have even the possibility of change be limited. Because that's the unique challenge that we face with a Trump and Vance presidency. Not simply the authoritarian character of their rule, but the fact that the possibility of challenging both them and the underlying unfreedoms that we experience even now, that those would be diminished. And without the possibility of change or protest, then no progress is possible at all.
Listeners can't see, I am nodding emphatically at that. A lot of agreement in the layers of danger posed. I was wondering, you worked with Sue before on this topic. What made you decide that you needed to return to it and that when you returned to it, you needed to focus on quote unquote young people.
There's a great tradition of political art that Sue belongs to. It goes all the way back to the late Middle Ages, early modern period, works by Peter Bruegel the Elder, the Flemish artist of the 17th century, who did images showing proverbs of various kinds, the blind leading the blind, for example. It goes up through the period of the 18th century with the Spanish artist Francisco Goya, who did a series on the disasters of war, showing the horrors of war. He did so in a way that was so challenging that the Spanish officials had to censor it. Couldn't be seen for 50 years after his death. And then into the 19th century, the French caricaturist Honoré Daumier represented the French revolutions of 1848 and 1871, and he represented as well the so-called caricature of manners, that is, the styles and the corruption and the foolishness of everyday life. And then you get into the 20th century, there are many political caricaturists, cartoonists, who people used to see regularly in their daily newspapers. There aren't so many newspapers today, so the art of caricature is a bit fallen on hard times. But Sue is somebody who's continued that tradition, and she illustrates for the New York Times, for The Nation, for Counterpoint, for many other magazines and journals. And whenever people see the art, they react to it immediately, because there's something about the 1-2 punch of word and image, of image and caption, that really grabs you. Woody Guthrie had written on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." His songs were a challenge to American fascism, to global fascism, to Nazism, to fascism in Italy. And so I would say about a good caricature, this art kills fascism. And that's what we try to do. Now, of course, it isn't possible for a single artwork or a single set of words or text to defeat fascism. It can hardly even challenge it. What it can do is raise questions, help organize an audience, create solidarity, so that a movement can then be born that will challenge authoritarianism, fascism, violence, racism, all those components of fascism.
You mentioned raising questions. What do you think in this moment is the top question that needs to be raised?
I guess the top question is the one that we've confronted in the United States for a long while. That's the question of democracy itself. The United States, as you know and your listeners will know, was highly limited in its democracy right from the beginning. We had a system of chattel slavery. We had a system of usurpation, that is, where the Native American population's lands were seized from them. We had an electoral college right from the beginning. We had a U.S. Senate that wasn't directly elected by the people. We had the possibility of presidents being elected even though they hadn't received majority votes. We had Jim Crow, segregation. We had McCarthyism, virulent anti-communism. We had lavender scares, repression of queers. All of that has severely repressed, and of course, women's rights were highly limited until the vote was granted them, and then an equal rights amendment was never passed for women. So we've had all sorts of limitations on democracy, but we have had also moments of liberation, of transformation. Voting Rights Act in 1964, gay marriage a decade or so ago, and other examples of the expansion of democracy. The possibility that democracy would contract was something that few people had really imagined even 10 years ago. But with the election of Trump and the overturning of the Dodd decision for abortion and the recent determination that presidents have near authoritarian power to do whatever they want, as long as it's an official act. So the message of the book and the message to young people today is democracy, your democracy, future democracy is under threat. And if that's under threat, then our very existence is under threat, because we also have hovering over all of this the danger of global warming. Within a generation or two, the planet could be almost unlivable. And Trump is somebody who has denied climate change. His mantra is drill, drill, drill for more oil. And all that comes to pass, it won't just be democracy that's on the line, but our very lives.
I was wondering if I could ask you, because you've worked with Sue for some time, whether I could ask you a question about her work. The artwork by Sue Cohen is, the words that come to mind first are striking. It's incredibly striking and dramatic. It has a powerful style that is at once her own, it's Sue's, but it's also evocative of the many great anti-fascist artists of the 20th century, including cartoonist Art Spiegelman, that our listeners are perhaps more familiar with. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what you know about her inspiration for the work that she does.
Well, Sue has had many artistic inspirations. She's one of the most informed artists you'll ever meet. Some artists really are art historians as well as artists, and others are not. And she's an art historian as well. So if you ask her about her own influence, she'll tell you better than any art historian can. It would include people like the German expressionists Katie Kolovitz, Otto Dix, Max Beckmann, John Hartfield. These are artists who worked during the interwar years in Germany, particularly, years of hyperinflation, fights between left and right, at a time when images were very powerful, when there were dozens of newspapers, dozens of magazines, maybe hundreds of magazines. And these all had their own particular audiences. And there were battles, if you will, between the readers of one magazine or another, virtual battles, sometimes street battles, but not so much about magazines. So she took all that on board. I would say the majority theme of her art has been about animal rights. And she and I have collaborated on works about animals and animal rights and animal liberation. She sees the struggle of animals as akin to the struggle of humans. If you speak about fascism impacting humans, then fascism against animals in concentrated feeding operations, factory farms, is the case as well. These factory farms were places where animals, beginning with the Chicago slaughterhouses of the 1890s and so on, were places where meatpacking went on, where animals would be brought together, fed, brought through an assembly line, killed, often cruelly, their bodies cut up in pieces, marketed and sold. That assembly line model was used by the Nazis when they wanted to kill Jews and Gypsies or Roma and others. That is, that people would be sent in cattle cars, brought to Auschwitz or Treblinka or Sobibor or any other death camps. They'd be disembarked from there, they'd be sorted, they'd be sent up a ramp into a death chamber, gassed, killed, and their bodies then subsequently burned. That's what happens to animals. And there's no reason for it. We don't need animals to live, to survive. The planet, in fact, requires the ending of animal agriculture if we're ever to get a handle on climate change. So she's been motivated by the cruelty toward animals her whole life. And I have been as well inspired by her to make that a cause of my own. So this book does have some discussion of animals, has some illustrations about the treatment of animals, and it helps to make the parallel case between the destruction, the violence against humans. Violence is central to fascism. It implies a leadership cult. It implies the beauty of violence, the necessity of violence, the wonders of war. The celebration of violence is something that is manifested in the animal industry and slaughterhouses, meat industry as well. And so it's a complete fight for liberation, humans as well as animals. Her art is unflinching in that regard. That's the hard thing to do, because if you show animal cruelty, as when you show cruelty and violence toward humans, there's a danger that your audience will flinch, and they'll do so much they'll simply close the book. And you have to, as an artist, be clever enough, you have to be cunning enough to use your instruments in a way that will get people to look. They may be shocked, they may be disturbed, but rather than close the book, they'll want to flip the page. And I think that's what this book does, and that's what Sue Ko does in her art.
The last part of what you were saying in particular really resonated with me. You know, the challenge of embracing people in a way to confront reality in its completeness, in a way that doesn't make them then go back and put their head in the sand and not look at anything ever again. I think about moments in art that have done that. I am always awestruck by the capacity to do that. Thinking of things like how even people with great concern about the right to abortion, for example, there were certain things that were deemed, we won't look at that, we won't go there, don't show images that portray the outcomes of when abortion, for example, is illegal. The reality of women bleeding out, of girls dead, that full reality, that people couldn't see that and be moved, or see that and see themselves, or see just other human beings and be like, I don't want that to happen. Like one recent example, I remember in such vivid detail, please correct me, I believe it was Richard Serra painting of Abu Ghraib.
Wouldn't have been Richard Serra.
I know he doesn't do sculptures, but it was a painting. It was one of those like stark paintings of Abu Ghraib. It was a lithograph. It was in the Whitney Museum of Art. It was this picture that was incredibly simple. And I remember seeing that and that having a huge effect on me at that time in a way that I didn't want to look at the actual images.
Well, I think you've recognized something that is a principle for Sue's art and other artists who work on political subjects or themes that are difficult to look at. That is, you have to overlay them often with a layer of metaphor. So while you will show something, a woman who used a coat hanger to induce an abortion and is bleeding out, and Sue actually has a painting early in her career that represents that. But the figures are elongated, somewhat exaggerated. There's a layer of myth, of metaphor overlaid so that we can gain a degree of distance from it. We can look at it, we can be shocked, we can be disturbed, but we won't be so disturbed that we can't look. And it's a very difficult line to draw between one thing and the other. You don't want to prettify something that's horrible. You want to tell the truth. On the other hand, you have to have people take a look at it. That's a art, and that's where a great artist with decades and decades of work behind her, like Sue Ko, is able to do that. And that's what I try to describe. The book includes a historical account of American fascism from its origins all the way up to the present. And then there's a section at the end where I analyze Sue's art and the constituent elements that make a political artist. And that's one of the things I talk about, is how you manage to walk that fine line between shock, horror, disturbance, and something which you can look at, which you can bear to see, and which you can even enjoy. There's a few things that she does. One of them is humor. There'll be some images that are really rough to follow, and then other images that are really funny. And then there'll be some where, even though it's tough, there'll be little anecdotal details. The expression of a figure, say it's a refugee on the border of Texas, and you'll see there'll be a child holding in her hand a teddy bear or something. And it sounds a little bit hokey. I'm not sure if there is image by her with that exactly in it, but it'll give you the idea. It may seem a little bit hokey, but it's something that grabs you and distracts you from the disturbance of the whole image. And that gives you a place, a little refuge for your eye and for your mind as you're looking at the rest of the picture. And that's necessary for a picture to work and be effective. Otherwise, it'd be just too disturbing and too bleak, and you wouldn't be able to learn from it or gain from it, or even take pleasure from it. This is a very challenging issue. People like Theodore Adorno, the philosopher, and Susan Sontag, the American critic, have talked about this. That is, what happens when you gain pleasure from an image of pain? Is that a contradiction? Have you failed as an artist or writer when you produce pleasure? Or is that a necessary part of conveying an image or an idea, having a conversation with your readers or your spectators? So that's one of the things that Sue's art also engages.
Really important questions. What you were saying about humor relates to my next question. And it's a little bit about just giving you a chance to talk about how you see this book fitting into the larger anti-fascist art milieu. I've seen Sue's work compared to John Hartfield, for example, the German artist who devoted himself to exposing the Nazis and their rise to power there. However, while his message was clearly opposed to the Nazis and often ruthless in how he ridiculed them, with hindsight, we may be able to point out some shortcomings in the moral clarity of his work, knowing what we know now about the danger of dehumanizing whole groups of people in the lead up to genocide. Sue Ko's work seems to build on this by continuing to ruthlessly depict these fascists while centering the suffering of the vulnerable people hurt most by these fascists.
Well, she moves back and forth between showing figures with power, Supreme Court justices, U.S. senators, newspaper publishers, online journalists, ex-presidents, etc. Between that and the people who are the subjects, both the victims of fascism and those who will be resisting. So she will sometimes bring them in the same image, and sometimes it'll be a completely other image. I'm thinking about, for example, a lino cut in which she shows a kind of Davos scene of all the high and mighty economic and political rulers brought together at a great table, and they seem to be divvying up the spoils of the world, while in the background, outside, you see the clamoring populations of the Southern Hemisphere particularly, wondering what's in it for them. And it's in a way hilarious. I mean, you have all these people showing their greed and their bloodthirstiness and their vulgarity, but it's also heartbreaking seeing the other people who are challenging it. And then also it suggests that there's a real danger for those high and mighty folks, that the people out there who are right now under the boot may, in their great masses, come together, and their numbers are much greater than those of the people with power and money. They may overwhelm this happy meeting room in Davos. Again, a mixed message, of victimization, victims becoming powerful, those who are victimizers, subject to the rule, maybe, potentially, of those who are now under their boot. So it's a hard story to tell in a single image, but that's what the great artists, the great caricaturists, the great cartoonists are able to do. It makes me envious. I'm just an art historian and critic. I wish I could draw. Sue always says things like, it's great to be an artist. I'll say to her, sometimes I give her ideas about artworks, I'll say, well, what about, the idea of Trump standing with the Supreme Court justices, he's putting money in their pockets or something like that. And she'll say, oh, that's an idea. And like a couple of hours later, she'll have this brilliant sketch that she's made. And I go, geez, if I could only do that, if I could just do something like that. It's just magic.
It really is. It really is. I agree. I can only draw in a way that impresses a 4-year-old or 5-year-old.
Well, that's pretty good. You can do that. Picasso said, it takes a genius to be able to draw like a child.
As I want to move into some current events and what's on people's minds right now as it relates to the book, we're recording this around the eve of the DNC, and I wanted to just ask if you could talk a little bit about what you think people need to understand at this moment about the basis for fascism in this country, where it arises from, and what it means to resist and stop fascism, even as the electoral candidate running against the fascist is also part of the current administration that is enabling a horrific genocide right now in Gaza.
Your listeners will probably know more about the shape and history and look of fascism than I will, but I will say only that there is no single shape or form of fascism, that, as people have said in the past, if fascism arises in the United States, it won't be wearing a swastika, the men won't have jackboots, you won't see the Hitler salute, you won't hear Sieg Heil. It'll be in the form of Americanism, of Pledge of Allegiance, of the American flag, of MAGA, and all that. And that means it'll be obedience to the idea of a ruler, of a Führer, if you will. And we certainly have that with Trump, whose legions follow him regardless of the felonies that he commits. It will be in the form of racism, of the suggestion that certain individuals or classes or ethnicities are superior to others. That's certainly the case with Trump's racism and rejection of immigration. It'll take the form as well of an idea that there was glories of the past, and that the only thing we need to do is to revive the glorious past into the present and future. And since the past can never be restored, and since the past wasn't glorious anyway, it always means that you're telling people that progress is impossible, and that the best you have now is the best that'll ever be. Because that's part of the message of fascism, is that it won't change. We need to cement in place what we have now. So all those things were displayed: the cult of the leader, the regressiveness, the turning backwards to a fantasized idea of the past, the ethnocentrism, the sexism, all that was part of the Republican National Convention.
I wanted to just ask if there was anything that I didn't ask you about the book or your work that you wanted to speak to.
Just that I think the book has a fairly light touch in terms of the writing, so it tells the history of American, if you will, fascism, the regressive elements of American history. It's leavened with hope, and that the images are fantastic. They're delight, troubling, haunting, nightmarish, hilarious, and I hope people will take a look at the book and enjoy it. And most of all, learn something and be challenged and be inspired.
In the show notes, there is a link to pre-order the book. There is a link to Sue's website. There's a link to her Instagram as well, so you can see some of the work that Stephen's described. And Stephen, if people want to follow more of your work and read more from you, should people be directed to your Counterpunch author page? Would that be the best?
Yes, the Counterpunch author page has a link to my 100 and some odd stories in Counterpunch over the last 4 years. There's another piece coming out on Friday about the month anniversary of the attempted assassination of Trump by Thomas Crooks. And when you link to that, you'll see my other stories, and you'll have my email address even if you want to send me comments. So I look forward to hearing from your listeners.
Thanks so much for talking with us, and thanks so much for the book.
You bet, Sam. Thank you. So long.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Want to help this show reach more people when it's needed most? Amazing! Help grow the community we need by literally wearing Refuse Fascism across your chest by purchasing one or more of our Refuse Fascism T-shirts. When you buy the shirt, you are also helping produce and promote the show. So see the show notes to get your shirt today. Patrons, you got a discount, so make sure you check the Patreon page. When it arrives, we hope you'll take a selfie or pic of your whole crew all wearing their shirts and tag Refuse Fascism to spread the word. Thanks to those who did so already. If you want to take a step further, become a patron for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/refusefascism. It really makes a difference in producing and promoting this all-volunteer independent weekly show. We'll be having our next patron virtual event next month, so patrons, please fill out the poll on our Patreon page to let us know what you're interested in. And thanks for your support. And if you can't give now, or if you did already, you're a patron, share the show with others. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our social media posts or our YouTube uploads. It helps this analysis reach more people and is so appreciated. And of course, follow, subscribe wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. As always, we really value hearing from you. So find us on social media at Refuse Fascism. Find us on YouTube if that's your jam, at Refuse_Fascism. If you're a YouTube person, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Or, of course, leave us a voicemail. See a link in the show notes. If you want to reach me, you can do so at Twitter at Sam B. Goldman, or drop me a line at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org, or on the TikToks at Sam Goldman RF. Big thanks to Mark Tinkelman, Richie Marini, and Lena Thorne for helping produce this episode. Happy birthday, Richie. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.